Attractiveness is not about what you wear. It's not about how much money you make, the kind of car you drive, or how tall you are. That might catch the eye. But what keeps the attention, what captivates the soul, is something entirely different. You see, the most attractive men are not chasing women. They're chasing purpose. When a man has direction, when his life is aligned with values, goals, and discipline, he doesn't need to seek validation. His energy speaks before he does. He walks into a room and without saying a word, he commands respect. That's not arrogance. That's certainty. That's a man who knows who he is and what he brings to the table. What makes a man truly magnetic is his emotional control. A man who doesn't react, who pauses, who observes, who chooses his words instead of spilling them is rare. And rarity is attractive because women feel safe around a man who's not governed by his ego. A man who listens before he speaks. A man who stays calm when chaos hits. Do you want to be more attractive? Fix your posture. Not just the way you sit or stand, fix the posture of your spirit. Are you constantly seeking attention? Or do you carry yourself like someone who respects his own time and energy? You don't need to pretend to be mysterious. You need to become less available to nonsense, less reactive, less driven by temporary pleasure. That alone makes you mysterious in a world full of noise. Attractive men aren't the loudest in the room, they're the most focused. They don't need to convince anyone of their worth. Their actions reveal everything. They don't play games, and they don't chase people who don't respect them. They are clear on their standards, and more importantly, they uphold them consistently. And let's talk about presence. There's something incredibly attractive about a man who is present, who listens, who isn't constantly checking his phone, who can sit in silence and not feel the need to fill it with useless words. That depth, that quiet confidence is magnetic. Masculinity is not dominance, it is protection, it is leadership, it is quiet strength. A truly attractive man is not seeking to impress everyone. He is seeking to become the best version of himself for him. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to be intentional. Build a life you're proud of. Keep your promises. Learn to say no. Respect your body, your mind, your boundaries. Because when you respect yourself, others will follow. Remember, your attractiveness is not about chasing women. It's about attracting the right woman by becoming the right man. And when you do that, you won't need to say you're attractive. Everyone will already know. A man who is driven by purpose has already stepped into a different dimension of masculinity. He no longer exists in the realm of boys chasing attention, competing for validation, or proving their worth to people who don't even know who they are. When a man wakes up every morning knowing what he is working toward, when his heart and his mind are aligned with a vision greater than himself, he naturally detaches from shallow distraction. That detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity. It's what allows him to move through the world with a quiet intensity. His presence speaks louder than his words. His time becomes sacred. And the moment a man starts protecting his time, his energy, and his peace, he becomes rare. In a world where men are constantly taught to chase wealth, to chase women, to chase status, the man who chooses to build instead of chase stands out. He stops asking, what do people think of me, and starts asking, am I aligned with who I truly am? That is the shift. That is when you stop living for applause and start living from purpose. And when a man does that, something changes in his energy. He becomes attractive not because he's trying to be seen, but because he is so deeply connected to his mission that people can't help but notice him. Attractiveness is not about popularity. It's not about being liked by everyone. It's about being respected by the right ones. A man with purpose is not desperate for attention. He's selective. Not because he thinks he's better than anyone, but because he knows his value. and he protects it. That protection of self is what makes him magnetic. He's not moved by trends or peer pressure. He's not shifting his identity every week to fit in. He knows who he is. And that knowing gives him power. Power that doesn't dominate, but inspires. Power that doesn't control others, but controls himself. Most men confuse pursuit with strength. But pursuit, when it's rooted in insecurity, is weakness wearing a mask. Running after people, after love, after validation, that's not masculine energy. That's emptiness. That's noise. The man who is whole within himself doesn't chase, he attracts. And he attracts by becoming, by growing, by showing up for himself every single day. He may not always be loud. He may not always be visible. But his consistency builds something that the world will eventually respect, whether it claps for him now or not. Purpose requires discipline, and discipline is the highest form of self-respect. When a man chooses discipline over distraction, he's already won a battle most never even notice. He's already ahead of the game, because most people are ruled by impulse. But the man of purpose doesn't follow every desire. He questions it, he evaluates it. He asks himself, will this serve my vision? And if the answer is no, he walks away without guilt. That's power, that's maturity, that's leadership, and that, whether you realize it or not, is deeply, deeply attractive. When a man is rooted in purpose, he stops performing. He becomes real, authentic, honest. He doesn't need to impress you with empty promises or inflated egos. His life speaks for him. His discipline, his routine, his energy, it all speaks for him. He doesn't need to post about success, he lives it. He doesn't need to talk about loyalty, he embodies it. And that level of integrity is something no amount of money or looks can replace. Purpose makes a man less reactive, because he's not here to waste time arguing over things that don't matter. He doesn't need to win every debate. He needs to win in life. He's not distracted by drama, gossip, or shallow attention. His eyes are set on something bigger, and because of that, he walks differently. He speaks with intention. He listens with presence. He makes decisions based on legacy, not impulse. And that's where you see the shift. He no longer moves like a boy who's trying to impress. He moves like a man who's building an empire. Even if it starts in silence. The truth is, most men are tired, not physically, but spiritually. Tired of trying to prove something, tired of running in circles, chasing people who don't value them, tired of the emotional roller coaster that comes with seeking love before building self. And the only way out of that exhaustion is to go inward, to ask deeper questions, to stop chasing and start becoming. The man who chooses to prioritize purpose over pursuit begins to feel alive again. He wakes up with direction. He knows what to say yes to, and more importantly, what to say no to. And in those quiet decisions, his life transforms. You want to be more attractive? Start by asking what you were created for. Start by identifying your gifts, your strengths, your calling. Start building something that no one can take away from you. Your character, your principles, your consistency. Because that foundation will outlast everything else. It doesn't matter how well you dress, how good you look, or how smooth you talk. If there's no substance beneath the surface, it's temporary. And women can feel that. The world can feel that. People can smell inauthenticity, even when it's wrapped in charm. Purpose grounds a man. It gives him a sense of identity that isn't tied to external outcomes. Whether he wins or fails, whether he's seen or ignored, he still shows up. Because his worth is no longer dependent on results. It's rooted in who he is, not what he gets. And that kind of man becomes unstoppable. Not because everything is perfect, but because he refuses to give up. He learns, he adapts, he evolves. He doesn't run from failure. He absorbs the lesson. He doesn't collapse under pressure. He channels it into power. That's not just attractive, that's rare. In a world where everyone is trying to be liked, the man who chooses to be respected will always rise above, because he's not entertaining every option. He's choosing what aligns with his values. And that ability to choose wisely, to delay gratification, to say no to pleasure for the sake of progress, that's what builds real confidence, not fake confidence rooted in likes and compliments, but real, unshakable confidence rooted in integrity. Purpose gives a man focus, and focus is power. When you're focused, you don't waste energy on what doesn't serve you. You don't engage in meaningless arguments. You don't beg for attention. You move with clarity, and people feel that. They notice. They may not always say it, but they feel it. Because a focused man is different. He's intentional. He's decisive. He doesn't drift. He directs. And women are not drawn to men who drift. They're drawn to men who lead, not with control, but with certainty, not with ego, but with vision. The truth is, you don't become attractive by chasing people. You become attractive by building yourself. You become attractive when you stop asking, how can I get them to like me? And start asking, how can I like myself more? When you start doing the hard things, when you start keeping your promises, when you start waking up early, showing up, pushing past resistance, that's when you feel proud of who you are. That's when your energy shifts. And once your energy shifts, your life follows. This world doesn't need more men trying to impress. It needs more men trying to grow. There is something unshakably powerful about a man who does not react to everything. In a world where people are constantly triggered, constantly offended, constantly spiraling into arguments and emotional chaos, the man who remains still, the man who breathes before he speaks, holds a level of strength that doesn't just command respect, it demands it. Emotional control is not suppression, is not coldness. It's not pretending to feel nothing. It's knowing how to feel everything and still choose your response with intention. A man who cannot control his emotions is a man who can be controlled by everyone else. He may look strong, he may sound confident, but all it takes is the wrong word, the wrong look, the wrong trigger, and he collapses. That is not strength, that is volatility. And volatility does not lead, it destroys. If you are easily triggered, you are easy to manipulate. Anyone can pull you out of your power. Anyone can control your energy. And that makes you weak, no matter how physically strong or socially dominant you may appear. True masculinity isn't in the loud voice, it's in the calm tone. It's in the way a man handles himself when he's disrespected, disappointed, or misunderstood. It's in the way he chooses not to lash out, not because he's afraid, but because he knows that reacting emotionally would lower his own standard. He knows his power isn't in what he says, but in what he doesn't need to say. That restraint, that self-mastery, is what separates men who are ruled by ego from men who are led by purpose. You don't build a legacy by reacting to noise. You build it by focusing on what matters and letting everything else pass. And let me tell you this, the man who chooses peace over pettiness, the man who chooses logic over impulse, the man who pauses, breathes, and thinks before he acts, that man is a threat in the best way possible, not because he's dangerous to others, but because he is no longer dangerous to himself. It takes emotional strength to sit in silence when your ego wants to fight. It takes emotional power to walk away from disrespect without needing to prove your worth. That's not weakness, that's maturity. Because not everything deserves your reaction, not everyone deserves your energy. When a man starts controlling his emotional temperature, he becomes a thermostat in every room. People look to him not because he's trying to lead, but because his presence is grounded. And let's be real, if your emotions are unpredictable, you're unstable. No woman feels safe with a man who can't manage his anger. No team trusts a leader who melts under pressure. No family can thrive under a man who erupts at every inconvenience. You want to be respected? Get control over your reactions. You want to be trusted? Stop being ruled by emotion. because emotions come and go, but the choices you make in emotional moments, those stay. And they shape your reputation, they shape your relationships, they shape your destiny. People confuse passion with instability. Just because you feel something deeply doesn't mean you have to act on it immediately. Passion without discipline is chaos. Anger without purpose is destruction. Sadness without purposing is depression. Love without boundaries is obsession. Emotional control doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you understand your feelings deeply before you move, before you speak, before you decide. That space, that pause, is where power lives. Who is deeply attractive? A man who can be criticized without crumbling. A man who can be challenged without turning it into a war. A man who can hear hard truths without becoming defensive or dismissive. That's emotional maturity. That's inner strength. Because anyone can be composed when life is going smoothly. But the real test is how you respond when things don't go your way. When people disrespect you, when plans fall apart, when the pressure rises, that's when the mask comes off. And if you haven't built emotional control, you will expose wounds that have never healed. You will bleed on people who didn't cut you. Emotional control is the foundation of wisdom, because when your emotions rule you, you cannot think clearly. You react instead of respond. You speak to be heard instead of listening to understand. You become addicted to emotional release instead of choosing emotional intelligence. And in that place, you become dangerous to your own growth. You self-sabotage, you burn bridges, you destroy opportunities, not because you aren't capable, but because you couldn't pause long enough to act from power instead of pain. A man who learns emotional control becomes untouchable, not because people won't try to provoke him, but because their efforts won't work. He doesn't take things personally. He sees through manipulation. He knows the difference between a distraction and a genuine challenge. That clarity gives him leverage in life, because while others are caught in emotional storms, he's already strategizing the next move. He's 10 steps ahead. And he's calm, because chaos outside doesn't shake the peace inside. You cannot master your life if you have not mastered your mind. And you cannot master your mind if you are emotionally reactive. Emotional control is not something you're born with. It's built day by day, moment by moment, by choosing to respond differently, by learning to breathe in discomfort, by observing yourself, your triggers, your patterns, your habits, and interrupting what no longer serves your higher self. It's easy to blame others for how we feel, but blame is emotional immaturity. Emotional control begins when you take full responsibility for your inner world. When you stop saying, they made me angry, and start saying, I allowed their behavior to affect my peace. That shift right there, that's where transformation begins. That's where you reclaim your power, because now you're no longer a victim of other people's behavior. You're in charge of your own response. A man who controls his emotions becomes a lighthouse. He doesn't move with the waves, he stands firm. He becomes the safe space, the protector, the guide, not because he knows everything, but because he has mastered himself. And let's be clear, this kind of man isn't common, because self-mastery is uncomfortable. It requires discipline, patience, and self-awareness. It requires looking at your wounds, your ego, your pride, and doing the work to evolve. But the reward? Peace, confidence, leadership, influence, respect. There's a difference between being emotional and being emotionally intelligent. Emotionally intelligent men don't suppress their feelings. They process them. They observe them. They channel them into productive outcomes. If they're angry, they use it to fuel discipline. If they're sad, they use it to motivate others. That transmutation of energy is what creates impact. That's what makes them powerful. You don't have to become emotionless to be strong. You just have to become wise enough to know which emotions are worthy of expression and which ones are better mastered in silence. You don't need to show the world every time you're hurt. Sometimes the most powerful move is to feel it, heal it, and grow through it quietly, gracefully, without losing your dignity. The man who learns emotional control doesn't just become more attractive, he becomes more peaceful, more focused, more effective. His relationships improve, his career accelerates, his leadership sharpens, because emotional chaos drains energy, but emotional control creates momentum, and that momentum carries him toward the life he actually wants, not the one he's reacting to. So if you want to rise, in love, in life, in leadership, master your emotions, feel everything, express what's real, but never let temporary feelings destroy permanent foundations. That's the difference between a man who is surviving and a man who is evolving. A man who respects himself changes the way the world treats him. That's not a theory, it's reality. You teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. If you don't respect your own time, your own energy, your own boundaries, no one else will either. Self-respect is not about arrogance. It's not about being cold, harsh, or rigid. It's about having a clear understanding of who you are and refusing to settle for anything that falls below that understanding. Because the truth is, when you lack self-respect, you start bargaining with your worth. You start accepting less. You start explaining your value to people who were never qualified to receive it. Standards are not about perfection, they're about clarity. A man who sets standards knows what he will allow, and more importantly, what he won't. He doesn't entertain every option, every opportunity, every person that enters his life. He filters, not from a place of ego, but from a place of intention. He understands that time is the most expensive currency, and he refuses to spend it on anything that subtracts from his purpose, his peace, or his progress. That is where real masculinity starts to show, in restraint, in discernment, in the quiet strength of saying no when it's easier to say yes. There's something deeply attractive about a man who doesn't need to prove himself to everyone. He doesn't need to be liked by everyone because his sense of self isn't dependent on the reactions of the crowd. That's what self-respect creates, a certain independence of identity. A man who's not moved by attention. A man who's not chasing validation. A man who doesn't need to explain his worth, because his life already reflects it. His habits reflect it, his standards reflect it. You can see it in the way he talks, the way he walks, the way he chooses what to engage with and what to walk away from. The man who sets standards is not difficult. He's discerning. He's not too picky. He's protective of his energy. He knows that what you allow is what will continue. And he's no longer in the business of convincing people to see his value. He's in the business of becoming so deeply aligned with his own value that the right people recognize it immediately and the wrong people disqualify themselves without him having to say a word. Now, that's what happens when your standards are high and your self-respect is real. You stop attracting chaos and you start inviting alignment. Most men don't set standards because they're afraid to be alone. They will tolerate disrespect, inconsistency, low-effort relationships, all because they haven't yet built the relationship with themselves. But when a man learns how to enjoy his own company, when he begins to prioritize his own growth, his own health, his own peace, something shifts. He no longer tolerates energy that feels heavy, dishonest, or confusing. He no longer participates in cycles that drain him emotionally or mentally. And that shift, that ability to walk away without guilt, is where self-respect becomes power. Respecting yourself means walking away when something doesn't align, not when it becomes unbearable. Most people wait until the damage is done, until the disrespect is obvious, until the pain becomes public. But a man with standards doesn't wait for disaster. He pays attention early. He listens to his gut. He observes patterns. And when something doesn't feel right, when a person's energy doesn't match their words, he steps back, not to punish, but to protect. That kind of emotional intelligence is rare. And that kind of strength is what makes a man unshakable. So true. You want to be respected by others? Start with how you treat yourself. Are you keeping the promises you make to yourself? Are you showing up with discipline even when no one's watching? Are you choosing relationships that bring peace, not chaos? Are you protecting your mental space, your sleep, your goals, your boundaries? Because the way you treat you, if you don't honor your own word, people won't take your word seriously. If you don't enforce your own standards, people will keep testing them. Setting standards is not about being judgmental, it's about being clear. It's about knowing your values and refusing to compromise on them for temporary comfort or external approval. Because once you drop your standards to keep someone close, you'll always have to stay beneath yourself to keep them. And in the process, you'll lose your identity. You'll lose your dignity. You'll lose your sense of self. And that loss is never worth it. No matter how attractive, powerful, or influential the person is, nothing is more attractive than a man who knows who he is and refuses to become smaller to be liked. When a man respects himself, he doesn't chase things that cost him his self-worth. He doesn't beg to be chosen. He doesn't lower his voice to be accepted. He doesn't engage in battles that destroy his peace. He walks with integrity, even if that means walking alone for a season. He doesn't tolerate manipulation, emotional games, or surface-level connection. He's not here for entertainment. He's here for alignment. That mindset, that level of seriousness, is what commands respect. Without force, people often confuse high standards with being controlling or overly demanding. But here's the truth. Standards are not demands, they're reflections of self-awareness. They're about knowing what energy supports your growth and what energy distracts you from it. A man who has built his life with intention cannot afford to let just anyone into his space, because energy is contagious, and the wrong energy, no matter how appealing it looks on the surface, will cost you more than it's worth. Having standards doesn't mean you're harsh. It means you're honest. It means you're willing to communicate your needs clearly and confidently. And if someone can't meet them, you don't try to lower them. You move on with peace, with dignity, without drama. Because you know that the right people will never ask you to shrink. They will rise to meet you. And the wrong people, they'll walk away. And you'll be fine. Because your fulfillment is no longer dependent on external approval. When a man respects himself, his relationships transform. He stops choosing from a place of loneliness or lust. He starts choosing from a place of clarity. He doesn't look for someone to complete him. He looks for someone who complements him, who aligns with his mission, his mindset, his lifestyle. He stops settling for the bare minimum and starts demanding emotional maturity, integrity, and consistency, not with force, not with arrogance, but with the quiet strength of a man who knows his value. The biggest sign of self-respect is not how loud you are, is how quietly you walk away from what doesn't serve you. No explanation, no argument, just a decision. Because you know your energy is sacred, you know your time is limited, you know that your future depends on the choices you make today, and you're no longer willing to gamble that future on temporary comfort or familiar dysfunction. You don't need to be aggressive to enforce standards. You need to be consistent. You need to know what you stand for. You need to know what you will and will not allow. And most importantly, you need to back it up with action. Because if you let people cross your boundaries without consequence, your standards are just suggestions. They mean nothing. But when you follow through, when you hold firm, when you detach from anyone who dishonors your values, that's when your standards start protecting you. There's a quiet confidence in the man who respects himself. He doesn't over-explain. He doesn't try to prove. He doesn't need to announce his standards. He lives them. And that energy is undeniable. It speaks before he does. It sets the tone. It shifts the dynamic. Because people feel it. The difference between a man who is grounded and a man who is lost. between a man who leads himself and a man who needs others to lead him. So if you want to elevate your life, start by elevating your self-respect. Stop chasing people who don't even value themselves. Stop lowering your standards for temporary attention. Stop explaining your worth to people who will never be able to receive it. Start building a life that reflects the man you truly are, not the one you've been pretending to be. And that begins with how you see yourself, how you speak to yourself, how you protect your space, your energy, your mission. Because once you learn how to respect yourself, everything around you changes.